And all right, in case you didn't know. So we want to welcome everyone to this program from the Green Team at Beth Ahm. I'm Rabbi Rubenstein, and I'm just really glad that you're here. So thanks for being with us, to our congregants and those who are visiting with us. Welcome. And I am going to turn the introductions over to Kathy Lichtman, who is a member of our Green Team. And she is going to introduce our speaker and our topic for tonight. Go ahead, Kathy.
Okay, so we decided to do something on bees, actually quite a while ago, but then the COVID came around. So we're getting to it now. And I found immediately, very luckily, Kaitlyn Tatro. Is that how you pronounce it?
Good. Tatro.
Tatro. She's works at the Environmental Interpretive Center at U of M Dearborn, and she's the PolliNation project coordinator, and she just graduated a year ago, 2020, so I'm pretty impressed. And the U of M Dearborn was the first public university to be recognized as a bee campus by the Xerxes Society, which is a big society that promotes insects as being so necessary for pollination and for our lives on this planet. So I'll let you take it away.
All right, fabulous. Thank you. That saves me from doing an introduction, which I always hate doing though. So thank you very much. All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me tonight. I am very happy to have a captive audience, even if it is in a virtual context this time. So like Kathy said, I am the coordinator for the PolliNation project, and I'm aiming for this program to be around 45 minutes. I am notorious for talking too much, so be warned. If you want to grab a drink now, some tea or something a little stronger, I recommend it. And yeah, so I'll start out just by explaining a little bit about what exactly the PolliNation project is, what we're doing at the EIC, and how it relates to these things called insect hotels, which are like the bird houses for the insect world. And then we'll get to meet the very bees that we are providing habitats for. So I'll walk you through some of the most common native species that use insect hotels. And then we'll get into the depressing stuff, which is the problems that are facing our pollinators, the struggles that, are hitting all of them, regardless of if they are bee, butterfly, hummingbird, whatever. But also some good news on what we can do to, let me just check the chat here. Okay. What we can do to really help them out, regardless of what type they are. And then we'll finish off. I'll explain a little bit more about insect hotels. So if you are interested in being a supporter of pollinators on your own home, or if you have like a community park or something like that, these are very family-friendly, children-friendly ways to attract bees to your yard or wherever and really help them out because they are struggling quite a bit to find their native habitats. All right, so that's enough for an intro. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the PolliNation project began roughly 2 years ago when I was still in school. My then professor at the time, Dr. David Susko, and I were really interested in pollinators. We have a lot of rain gardens and pollinator gardens on our campus, but we were really noticing that in the community, there seemed to be a lack of gardening techniques and or habitats that really bolster these pollinator populations. And so we thought, hey, why don't we harass the community and see if we can get them on board with us to, really try and push for protecting and helping out our pollinators. So we did. So we applied for a grant in 2019, and I'm happy that we did obtain it. So the Ford Motor Company Fund, we're very grateful to them for funding this project. And in essence, we have 3 goals. And the biggest one is to be involved with the community. So community science, making scientists out of homeowners and everyday people who may not necessarily have this as their career path or interest. So really trying to engage and encourage the community to protect our pollinators, because regardless of what your field is or your interests, we all depend on pollinators. So with the funding that we got from the Ford Motor Company Fund, we actually built 200 public insect hotels. This is an example of one here. Unfortunately, we cannot give everyone this awesome Block M hotel. That one's unique, but we do have some nice designs. But we have 200 of these. And if you would like to participate in this project, the idea is that we have a registration link. You can sign up, you will receive a free insect hotel, with the only caveat being that we ask you to report back to us on what types of insects are using pollinators. Because insect hotels are known as a gray area in science, which basically means that it's still being studied. So there's no definitive science on it yet. But what we have so far does seem to point that native bees do benefit from having insect hotels around. So the next part that we were hoping to do, but obviously COVID has kind of put it on the shelf for now, was have public workshops. So we would invite people on campus. We're still planning on doing this at some point, but it's just been pushed back somewhat indefinitely. We'll see where things kind of go from here. But basically, you would be able to come to campus. We would do a program very similar to this, but in person with snacks and beverages. Do not worry. And you would essentially be able to go home with your insect hotel. So we would let you assemble it there. So really nice to kind of engage people with that. And the last part, of course, is to design 16 larger insect hotels. And by larger, I mean around 5 foot by 5 foot. So pretty significant size insect hotels. And these are planned to go to 16 Dearborn public schools. It piggybacks off of a previous grant that we did where we actually went in and we built schoolyard vegetable gardens. So we completed that project already last year. But what is the best way to decorate your garden? Of course, by having an insect hotel, because not only is it a unique feature, but it also has a purpose ecologically. So we are now introducing the youngest and brightest minds to what it is to be a pollinator conservationist, and hopefully arouse some interest in them that they can see kind of what the bees are doing in real time whenever they go out to their gardens. And this is actually a perfect way to introduce, younger people to bees, because these bees are not aggressive. So there's not really a risk of being stung by them. All right. So we also focused on this being student driven. That was our second big goal. So in order to collect the data for this project, we of course had to find someone to build us an app. And what better place to find, intelligent minds than our own campus. So we went to the College of Computer Science and we requested help from the students, and they were amazing. We had 2 excellent teams come on board. They built us a pollinator ID app, which is kind of like iNaturalist if you've ever used it. You basically can take a photo of a pollinator that you see, and it uses an AI to try and match it up with the most likely candidates. So trying to help people get familiar with their native bees. And then we also have what's called a geospatial app. So think of like Google Maps if you're trying to find certain locations and it brings a pin up for you and it kind of pings. Same idea, but this lets staff at the EIC track where all of the public insect hotels are in the community. And for us, that helps a lot with the science aspect. So when we go to analyze the data, we'll be able to use this app to basically correlate any sort of patterns we see with the distribution of all the insect hotels. And then, of course, we had people that help with the manual labor, because building 200 of these, it's a small number, but when you're actually picking up the hammer and nails, it suddenly becomes a lot more. So again, we had a great involvement from our students. They came out and helped us build these, and everyone had a good time. And I'm happy to say that, as Kathy mentioned, all of this did help us become a bee campus. So because of our management practices, this initiative that we're doing to engage the community, the different types of courses we have available at our university, this all wraps up into this nice bundle of being certified as bee friendly. And it's really the whole idea of this, not so much for bragging rights, but it's supposed to inspire other campuses and other cities to get on the map. So really trying to inspire others to do the same kind of work. And it has been working. So in the past couple of years, there's been a lot more campuses and cities in Michigan that have popped up. So this is an older picture. All right. So now we'll take a moment here and close your eyes if you have to. Just take a breath. What do you picture when you hear the word bee? All right, so hold on to that image. Open your eyes. My guess is that all of us probably pictured one of these two species. So on the left, we have one of my personal favorites, is a bumblebee, which are probably the most visible ones you see in your yard. Those are the ones you always hear buzzing around. They're bright yellow, beautiful patterns, and they absolutely love every single flower. I've seen them visit probably every single flower in my garden. So awesome bees. The other one you might have pictured is the one you hear about all the time in the news. These are our honeybees. And of course, we depend on them for different products like honey, beeswax, propolis, which I'm not sure people are familiar with. It's another product they make. Fun fact, impress your friends, propolis. But really, the fact is that we have many more bees than just these two species. And interestingly enough, most people think of a honeybee when they think of the best pollinator out there. But what you might be surprised to know is that bumblebees are native to North America, but honeybees are not. They actually came over from Europe back in the 1600s with the colonists. And the colonists brought them over because they wanted the honey, they wanted the wax, and they also wanted their crops pollinated. And at the time, they thought honeybees were the only real pollinators out there. Little did they know that in the United States, we have more than 3,600 different species of bee native to our continent. And in Michigan, we have over 450 different bee species. Another fun fact you can impress your friends with. All right, so something important to note about our bee species. So when most people think of bees, they think of honeybees or bumblebees. And these two species are unique in the bee world, and that's because they are social. When most of our bees are actually solitary. So solitary means that they spend the majority of their life alone. So unlike honeybees and bumblebees, which form kind of large groups, honeybees being the extreme version where they can have upwards to 80,000 different bees in a single hive, our native bees, statistically speaking, are vastly solitary. And this is good for a number of reasons. So for homeowners, for instance, if you want to provide for native bees, you don't have to worry about all of a sudden having 80,000 guests on your small little plot of land, depending on what you have. But this also means that solitary bees, because they don't have a nest, they don't have a queen, they don't have a cast of workers or brood, which are young bees to protect, this is why they tend to be not aggressive, because there's really no value in them staying to fight when they have nothing to protect. So another great reason why it's easy and a great reason to provide for our native bees. So our native bees also, majoritatively, so 70% of them will nest in the ground. So unlike honeybees, which tend to go to nest in trees or find some sort of old wood block, most of our bees will actually go on the ground. And this is one of the reasons that many of us tend to not notice them as much. One, because they're solitary, so you may not see them nearby, but also because they spend a lot of the time looking for nests and building them in the ground. The good news is that if you have that stubborn patch of lawn that will absolutely not grow anything, and you're thinking, well, this is just useless, fear not, it is not useless. You can actually set aside a piece of your lawn that is looking a little sad in terms of plants, and it will be a perfect habitat for ground nesting bees, like this cellophane bee down here, which I think are absolutely adorable, but that's just me. Now, the other 30% of our bees are what are known as cavity nesting bees. And these 30% here, this 30%, is what we'll use an insect hotel. And those are the ones I'm going to focus on today. So you can see some examples of our different cavity nesting bees here. And even though they are the quote unquote minority, they still make up over 130 different species in our state. So you can provide a lot of diversity in our pollinators by having an insect hotel on your lawn. If you can't tell already, I'm really trying to sell the idea of you having your own insect hotel on your lawn. All right, so let's talk cavity nesting bees. So in the wild, what they look for is like you see on the screen here. So this is a tree that has leftover cavities that were likely left behind by some sort of woodpecker, sapsucker, or wood-boring beetle. And these cavities are perfect real estate if you are a cavity nesting bee. This is what you're looking for. It's protected from the elements. You can seal it off with something to keep out the weather or some uninvited guests, perhaps. That's the kind of habitat they're looking for. So when a cavity nesting bee finds this kind of habitat, they will immediately begin to collect as much pollen as they can. And a lot of them have certain traits that help them do this. So this bee, for example, is carrying all of the pollen on its legs and a little bit under its abdomen. So the female, who is the one that makes her nest, will go to all these different flowers. She will carry as much pollen as she can carry until she looks like a pom-pom. And then she will fly back to the cavity that she has found. And once she's in the cavity, she'll actually crawl inside of it as far back as it goes, and she will drop off all of the pollen in this very neat ball. And on top of that pollen ball, she will lay a single egg. And after she has laid that egg, she will block off the cell. So here you can actually see the different life sequences or stages, thank you, life stages of the bee larva as it develops. So here is some leftover pollen, and there's probably, I think that's the egg on top of it. Here is a larva that has hatched, of course, and eaten the pollen. And then here is a larva that's in the final stage before it emerges as a bee. So this is a pre-pupa. And when she lays her eggs, you'll notice these little caps that are in between these cells. So she literally builds doors, essentially, to cap off each section of the cell. And the cool thing about this is that even if you don't know how to identify bees, you can tell what kind of bee is using this cavity based on what they're using to cap off these cells. And so you'll notice this in the next couple of slides. So unfortunately, we don't have time for me to go over all 130 different species of bees, but lucky for you guys, I'm only going to go over 6 today. So there's 6 main groups of these bees that will use insect hotels. And if you have your penny, this is where you will want to pull it out for the semi-interactive portion. Excellent. All right. So the first main group of bees that will use an insect hotel are referred to as mason bees. So you can see right here where they get their name from. So these cavities have all been capped off with some sort of mud, clay mixture, and they actually use part saliva, part water, part dirt to make these cells. And that's where they get their name from. And we have roughly 30 different species in Michigan currently. Some of them are introduced, most of them are native. And right here, we have the mascot of the mason bees. So I'll talk a little bit about this one because they're pretty cool. So these are blue orchard mason bees, blue because of their color, orchard because that's where they pollinate typically, and then mason bee based on how they make their nests. And blue orchard mason bees are actually becoming very popular because when it comes to pollination, they really can't be beat in the orchard. So one single female blue orchard mason bee can do the same amount of pollination as over 200 honeybees. So a lot of Michigan orchard owners are actually looking towards these guys to do pollination in their orchards as opposed to honeybees. So it's a kind of a win-win for both of them. And you can see here, one of the reasons why you may not have seen these bees in your garden, they can be pretty small. So the orchard bee is closer to this size, but you really have to look at them to determine that they're a bee. So one of the ways you can identify a mason bee is based on its size, but then also they tend to be a solid color with a metallic sheen. So this one here is blue. There are some that are green and some that are black and have like a metallic disco-y color if the light hits them right. They're very pretty. They also tend to have hairy heads, and then they have a lot of hair along the sides of their abdomens and thoraxes, just in case you are curious about identifying them. But just know that bee identification is hard, so it is okay if you don't get it on the first go. There are experts in the field that still have to use microscopes to figure out different bee species. But they're very cool if you see them in the field. They're very colorful. All right. leafcutter bees. So there is a pattern here if you begin to notice it. So they get their name from the way that they build their nests. So here you can see a female leafcutter bee who is carrying a leaf part back to her nest, and that's what she will use to separate the cells and then cap off the nest once she's finished with it. So they're slightly larger than mason bees. And you can see here, though, that their pattern is different. So solid black, and they have these white bands along their abdomen. And you can't see it too well in this photo, but I call them the street sweepers of the flower world, because they have these tiny hairs all along the bottom of their abdomens. And as they're walking across the flowers, they will literally sweep off the pollen. And that's how they collect all the pollen that they need to make enough food for their nests. So we have roughly 44 species in Michigan. These are also very efficient pollinators. There's one leafcutter bee known as the alfalfa leafcutter bee. Probably guess where it gets its name from, but excellent pollinator of alfalfa, which is a very important feed item for a lot of our animals that are raised for agriculture. All right, so 3 of 6. Small resin bees, again, you could probably guess where they get their name. Small, they use resin. All right, so small resin bees are very cool. I rarely see them because they are so tiny, as you can see here. We also only have 4 species in Michigan. Right here is the bellflower resin bee. Absolutely tiny. I think this is an aster flower. So if you know what a New England aster flower looks like and how small those flowers are, and this bee fits entirely on it. So you can kind of guess where they get their name from. So one of the reasons that native bees are so important is because of the diversity that we have. So already you can see how much the sizes vary between species. And this is important because a lot of our native plants and our native crops have made these relationships with these pollinators, and sometimes size plays a big role into whether you can pollinate a certain plant. So for instance, a bumblebee is not really going to be able to pollinate a grape hyacinth, for example. The flowers are too small. It wouldn't be able to get to the anthers on the inside. So for that reason, the small resin bees are also important because they can reach inside of those smaller plants and basically ensure that those plants can reproduce. And they make their resin, they get their resin actually from different species of plants. Certain plant species do produce resin. Please don't quiz me on which ones. You'll be disappointed that I don't know too much about that, but it is very cool because you can very clearly tell if you have a small resin bee. It's like a solidified caramel color. Very cool to see. All right, we have an outlier here, a stranger. The Mexican grass-carrying wasp. Now, this is a species. This is a single type of wasp. And I gave it a slide, its own slide, because some people get a little worried when they hear about wasps or having wasps on their lawn or on their property. And just to reassure you, the Mexican grass-carrying wasp is very gentle. So again, it's solitary. It doesn't build a hive like other wasps, like what am I thinking of? Like paper wasps or yellow jackets. It doesn't make those big nests like they do. It's solitary. And essentially, it will make its little grass nest here, and then it will be on its way. And even though sometimes we may get into conflict with wasps and even some bees, they are incredibly important to the ecosystem. Wasps, especially so, because they're referred to as biological controls. So this means that they control the populations of other species that we definitely don't want in our gardens, like aphids, for example, or crickets and grasshoppers. So wasps are predatory, which means that they go after other organisms. And it's actually kind of cool because you can tell its life history by just kind of looking at it. So if you notice that most bees are covered in hair to some extent, and hair, the reason they're covered in hair is because they need pollen to help their eggs survive. But since wasps are predatory, they don't have any need for pollen. So that's why most wasps that you see are hairless or nearly hairless, because they don't need that hair to pick up pollen. The shape as well gives you a hint about how a wasp basically survives. So you'll notice here that you have the abdomen, and you can't see it too well in this photo, but there's a very thin waist. So that basically goes thorax, which is here, thorax, then it has a waist, and then it has an abdomen. And this little narrowing here actually lets the wasp be flexible. They're the envy of cheerleaders everywhere. So because of this flexibility, they're able to basically wrap their abdomens around, and that's how they sting their prey. So that is one feature you can actually use to tell apart a wasp from a bee. Wasps are very robust, so they don't have that sort of waist in between. But if you see something that does have this waist, it's more likely going to be a wasp. So it's kind of neat because once you kind of learn these characteristics, even if you don't know what species you're seeing, you can still tell like, okay, this is a bee, or okay, this is a wasp. So there's some fun things to learn. All right, I spent a lot of time on these guys, but I really like them. They're cool to see. So you can tell where they get their name because they do carry grass. And if you're curious about what their larvae eat, because they don't eat pollen, they actually go out and they paralyze crickets, and they carry crickets back to the nest. So I feel bad for the crickets, but it is an honorable sacrifice, and they are actually helping out the ecosystem in the end. All right, these ones are cool. So wool carder bees, this is the 5th genus that I'll be talking about. So one more after this, we're almost there. But wool carder bees are super cool. And that's because their nests look absolutely fluffy and comfortable. Now their name can be kind of fooling? Their name can be kind of tricky because they don't actually use wool to make their nest. What they do is this behavior called carding, where the female will actually pull fibers off of a plant. So that behavior is referred to as carding, that pulling the fibers off. And that's what the wool is. So it's actually a plant fiber. And I have here a female that I captured in my yard, and this is a lamb's ear leaf. So if you have lamb's ear in your yard, it is very, very likely that you have a wool carder bee nearby because they love any sort of hairy, fibrous plant. And this, sometimes people mistake this for a wasp, which is very easy to see why. This pattern is very waspish. But if you look at the other features that this bee has, that's how you can basically sort of work out that it's not a wasp. So there's no waist here, and it's also covered in quite a bit of hair. You can see on the female here, she has like a lion's mane, very regal. So we have 4 species in Michigan. Unfortunately, 2 of them are invasive. So these 2 are actually the 2 invasive species. And the reason they're invasive is because they are aggressive towards other bees. So they're territorial. They will actually defend a flower patch from other bees. And they do this by sword fighting. So the males actually have teeth at the end of their abdomen, which are basically just modified parts of their carapace, their shell here. And they will quite literally sword fight other bees. And unfortunately, our native bees have no idea what this sword fighting is. And they usually come away from these encounters either severely injured or most often killed because the males of the species are quite aggressive towards them. So these, oftentimes, these 2 species are found in urban areas. They're just seem to be rather good at adapting towards our urban centers. So it is likely that if you put an insect hotel out and you have some sort of lamb's quarter or other fiber seed plant nearby, it's likely that you may see these guys around there. All right, another outlier, small trees. Not to be confused with the large carpenter bee that makes a summer home in your summer home, in your cabin. All right, so small carpenter bees, as you can see by their name here, I can't even see this one without my glasses. But yes, they are very tiny, but they're also an outlier. And the reason is in this picture here. So all of the species that, or the groups that I've talked about, build their nests in horizontal cavities. Small carpenter bees will build their cavities in vertical ones. So the way that you can actually provide for small carpenter bees is simply by cutting your dead stalks, your dead flower stalks, closer to the ground. So roughly a foot to 15 inches if you just kind of lop them off. That is perfect habitat for a small carpenter bee. So what they are looking for are these stems that you can see here. And the stems are full of a tissue called pith with a P, P-I-T-H. And pith is a very soft tissue. And what they will do is they will actually chew out a cavity in this plant pith. And if you are watching close enough and you have a small carpenter bee nearby, you'll find what looks like snow next to these dead stalks, and that's actually just the excavated plant pith. So the best time to do this, if you are curious, is right after the winter thaw. So if you go through, if you leave your dead stalks through the winter, that's perfectly fine. That's actually ideal. But then come back in the spring and just kind of deadhead them. And then once it starts warming up, the small carpenter bees can use this for their habitat. Very cool. All right. Now that we've met our flying friends, it's time to talk about why we may not be seeing as many of them around beyond their small size. So unfortunately, there are a lot of issues facing our pollinators today, and most of them are caused by human activity. And so the common problems that face them currently, I'll just go over a quick list of them. The biggest one by far is pesticides. So the use of pesticides is really, I mean, the science is out there and we know that it's devastating, but a lot of pesticides, I don't think people realize that majority of them, regardless of their type, do some sort of harm to insects. And that's why it's become such a hot topic now. So even pesticides that are marketed as being, for herbicides, like for plants, or for fungicides, which are specifically for funguses, even though that they are marketed towards that specific group, oftentimes the chemicals cross over and affect different species from different groups. So an herbicide can actually harm a pollinator or, a hummingbird that comes visit it. And it really just has to do with the chemistry behind these pesticides. There's a new one out there called neonicotinoids. It's a long word, but there's a lot of studying going into that right now because that one seems to be quite potent towards native bees. And the downside is that even if a pesticide doesn't kill a bee, it can severely impair them. So they can become confused after encountering it. They can become lost. So for instance, honeybees have been recorded not being able to find their way back to the hive, which of course, if they don't find their way back, it's kind of a death sentence. So yeah, it's just it's a tough choice because pesticides are necessary in some case, but by far they're overused. So it is getting better though, but still. All right, the next biggest factor that is limiting our pollinators is the lack of habitat and food resources. And you can see right here what I'm talking about in this picture. So in North America, it is common practice to have these beautiful green lawns, and everyone loves to have a lawn, which has just become a staple of, the American dream. But the problem is that if you're a pollinator, this luscious green lawn is a desert. There is nothing that they can find here that they can eat or even use as habitat. The only thing that grass is going to really support is weeds, your parents weeding, because if they always want to weed their gardens, and probably grasshoppers. You'll probably have grasshoppers in there, but that's really roughly it. It's a monoculture, which means that there's only one thing there. And whenever you have a monoculture of something, there's not going to be a lot of diversity or different species coming in that can survive there. Parasitism is another big one. So there are specific bees that will parasitize other bees. And the way they do this is actually by just taking over a nest. So for instance, if a parasitic bee discovers a nest of a leafcutter bee, for example, it will actually lay its own eggs inside of that nest. It knows how to break through the seal that the leafcutter bee has. And once it lays its own eggs, the eggs will hatch faster than the bee host. And basically it will kill the host and then eat all the food. It's the worst kind of dormitory partner. want to have that kind of roommate. All right, competition from invasive species, like that wool carder bee I mentioned, invasives that have come over just either on accident or that have been introduced, but not only from invasive bees, but also invasive plants. So sometimes invasive plants can play into the lack of habitat and food resources because it can outcompete a native plant that perhaps one of our native bees relies on to get its food. So that's another big issue that we're tackling. And then lastly is disease. I have an example here, chalk brood, but that's more for honeybees. So chalk brood is a fungus that honeybees typically pick up when they're out foraging. The spores can sometimes be left on pollen on different flowers. And it's harmless to the adult bees, but it's fatal to the larva. So if the larvae consume it, they will die pretty much. This doesn't affect our native bees so much because they don't have those big nests. It's more so a problem in hives. So like for bumblebees or for honeybees, anything that had any species that is social and makes those big nests, this would be more of an issue for. But there are other diseases too that are affecting our native bee species as well. All right, but it's not all doom and gloom. The best part about being the cause of these problems is that you can also be the solution. So there are many ways we can help. The biggest one I can probably advocate for is to limit the use of pesticides. So this mostly goes for large agricultural processes, but this also applies to, communities and even homeowners. It's sometimes seeing those dandelions in the lawn is absolutely infuriating, but sometimes it's also better to just handpick them. So if you can, try and limit the use as best you can. I do admit that there are some instances where pesticides are needed. The benefits outweigh the costs. But in general, society does seem to have an over-reliance on them quite a bit. So when they do need to be used, though, you can basically push the application to later in the day. So if you apply later in the evening, like right before sunset, you're kind of in the sweet zone because bees are active during the day. And then many of our beneficial insects are active during the night. So if you kind of hit that in-between sweet zone, just before sunset, then you kind of apply it during that zone where there's the least amount of activity. So you have the least amount or least chance of it being carried over to something unintended, like a bee or a moth, for example. All right, the next biggest step, and probably one of the easier ones, plant a native garden. So several of you have already mentioned that you have native gardens, which is excellent. You're already being a part of the solution to helping our pollinators. So I do have some lists of plants as well in the next couple of slides that are excellent pollinator plants. And last but not least, think about providing and maintaining habitat. So that sad patch of your lawn that just won't grow anything, consider leaving it aside for any of those ground nesting species. Or if you want something more physical that you can kind of maintain a little easier, then consider building an insect hotel, which will help a lot of our cavity nesting species. All right, so different plants that attract native bees and wasps. The most important aspect of this beyond the plants being native is that you really want to have plants with overlapping blooms. And what I mean by this is that, for example, in the spring, you want to have spring flowering plants. So, for example, golden alexanders, penstemon, cherries, these all bloom out in the spring. In the summer, you would consider planting like swamp milkweed, culver's roots, yellow giant hyssop, bee balm, and these are all plants that flower out in the summer. And in the fall, we have, for example, lobelia, cut plant, goldenrod, pale leaf asters, pale leaf sunflower, so on and so forth. And the idea here is that all of these blooms overlap, and I'll show you on the next slide here. So all of these bloom times overlap, and that basically gives the bees a constant food source. So there's never any sort of famine for them you can think of. So they always have something that provides for them. And this is actually, I love this publication. It's by Michigan State Extension, and I can share the link to the PDF if you want access to this. But they've actually listed out some native plants, and also some other information, for example, how much or how beneficial it is for native pollinators like bees. So Culver's root is excellent. Wild strawberry is good. And then it also shows you natural enemies. So for example, how resistant it is to like deer or aphids, etc. But then the cool part here is it shows you exactly when the peak bloom is, which is the yellow, and then the length of the entire bloom, which is the white. So you can see the range of all these different plants and how long they're going to bloom for. And if you have a garden like this, then that's an excellent food source for all these different bee species because they always have something there. All right, so those are the flowers. Now we move into the insect hotels. So insect hotels are essentially man-made versions of the natural cavities these cavity nesting bees would find in the wild. So the common materials people use for them are hollow reeds, plant stems, bamboo, drilled blocks, straws, you name it, as long as it has a cavity, they will likely use it. Although I do stress that you should try to go for natural materials, of course, just because, well, many reasons, biodegradable, the bees have evolved for natural materials, so just those kind of basic reasons there. And then by using these materials, you attract these cavity nesting species. So these are the ones that we went over earlier. And just as a reminder, native pollinators are some of our best pollinators. So think of the blue orchard mason bee that can do the same amount of pollination as 200 honeybees, or the alfalfa leafcutter bee, which is used for alfalfa and is also more efficient than honeybees. This pattern kind of plays in with our native pollinators that they have these special relationships with plants. And while honeybees are great because they will pollinate virtually anything, those special relationships between certain bees and their host plants are crucial at times. And you really want to protect those relationships because that supports all of us in the end. All right, so this is actually the insect hotel design that we use for our project. So I think it's about 1 foot by 8 inches. I can't remember, 1 foot by 10 inches. But really the design doesn't matter. It's what's on the inside that counts, which goes for all of us. But you can really make the shape however you want. What you do want to aim for, though, is a certain depth or width of the wood, rather. So for our insect hotels, we went with 6 inches. So if you are interested in making your own insect hotel, they are super easy to build. You can use scrap wood, you can use aluminum cans, you can use an empty pop bottle, really anything. Again, it's just what's on the inside. So for example, we just used regular wooden boards, and these are the 1 foot, sorry, I'm trying to remember, 1 inch by 6 inch by 6 foot boards. Gosh, can't remember those numbers. But essentially, you just want to have roughly 6 inches for the depth. And that's really just goes back to the bees having enough room to build out their cells. So if you build something that's too shallow, the bee is going to look at that and say, no, I need something bigger. They're going to go find something else. So you just want to have as long as possible, or as long as you're comfortable with, and that will give you basically a better chance of attracting bees to using it. Something else to consider is to have a variety of diameters in your cavities. So you see, or you saw those penny comparisons where you had all those bees of different sizes. That naturally will play into what cavity they make their nest in. So for example, blue orchard bees have a preference for cavities that are roughly 5/16 inches across. And this is actually a diameter that someone figured out. I don't know how they figured this out, probably just by looking at it, but this is the actual diameter length that they will look for. And also of note is that the same diameter will also attract a Mexican grass-carrying wasp, whereas the leafcutter bees are only roughly a quarter of an inch. That's typically what they look for their nests. So the moral of the story here is that if you provide a variety of diameters, then you will attract a variety of native cavity nesting bees. And if you have a garden with a variety of plants, it's a good idea to do that because your garden will be beautiful and blooming from all these pollinators. All right, so you have spent a hard day building your insect hotel or gone to Home Depot, and now you have this wonderful insect hotel and you want to figure out where to go from here. The best place to put your insect hotel, ideally, would be in or near a garden. And that's because most of our bees have a very short flight distance. So they will stay within a roughly 500-meter diameter circle from where they hatch or where they emerge from. So the closer you put it to a garden, the more likely the bees that nest in your insect hotel will stay there and basically pollinate what's ever around them. So in or near a garden, excellent. Something else that's a little kind of quirky is to actually have it face southeast. So this is an insect hotel that we have installed at the EIC. You can actually go there and see all the different bees that have made use of it so far. And it's facing southeast because that's where it gets the most direct sunlight. So insects, I think all insects, are thermally activated, which means they depend on warm temperatures to basically be active. And this is especially true for bees. Maybe not for all insects, but bees definitely yes. So for bees, if it's not warm enough, they won't be flying out and about. So the more sunlight you can have fall onto your insect hotel, the more likely that the bees will look at this as a good spot to make their nest. And the last kind of tip I have is to keep it off the ground. 3 to 5 feet is sort of arbitrary. As long as it's not directly on the ground, you should be okay. And the reason being is that prevents it from flooding in case there is a heavy rain, and also from other critters getting into it. So like centipedes or ants, sometimes they will eat the larva that is inside there if they can get into it. The last feature I forgot to mention on the before slide is if you install one of these, make sure it has a roof. This goes back to the water. So the bees can drown if there is a heavy rain. So having a roof just gives it an extra layer of protection to keep the water from drowning them out in their tubes. All right, and maintenance, of course. All right, so there's a lot of debate going on in the community if you really need to do any maintenance for this or if it's best to just leave it where it lie. I myself think that it's probably best to replace the material every 2 to 3 years or when it starts to look a little scary. But really this only applies to if you have a large insect hotel. So for instance, like the 5'5" ones that we have on our campus that we're planning on putting to the schools. And that's just because cleaning it out lowers the risk of disease spreading and basically killing a whole swath of bees. And it also lowers the risk of parasitism if you clean it out occasionally. So if you're having a small one, like anything smaller than like 2 feet, 2 by 2 feet, you probably don't have to worry about this too much, but it is a good practice. So I won't say you have to, but I won't tell you that you don't have to, if that makes sense. All right, and the last part is to winterize. So what do you do in the winter? My saying is just to leave it outside, because in the wild, that is what the bees would do. There's no nice lumberjack that cuts down their tree and takes them inside with him. So you can leave it where it lay. If you want to store it, feel free to do so. That will actually, it will maintain or prolong the lifetime of the insect hotel because you'll protect it, of course, from the elements. But just remember that if you store it somewhere, that the bees are thermally activated. So if you store it in your nice warm fruit cellar that is like 50 degrees or so, you're going to have a lot of confused, sad bees in your fruit cellar because they will have emerged too soon. So if you do take it inside, just make sure it's somewhere that is sort of reflective of the temperature outside. So in the shed, for example, is fine. In a garage is probably okay. But again, I always recommend just leaving it outside. You can place a cloth over it if you want to protect the face of the insect hotel from a curious woodpecker or other hungry bird. I do recommend that as well. Trying to think what else. Oh, the life cycle of the bees. Yes. Here we go. So typically our bees will make their nests in the spring and early summer. That is the hot spot for them making their nests. the bees will actually overwinter. So from spring to summer, it takes 1 whole year for those bees to mature. So they will actually overwinter. That's why if you take the insect hotel inside, you may have some confused bees because they'll think that spring has already come. So you can tell if they are still inside the insect hotel by seeing if there are any gaps or breaches in the materials capping the cells. So for instance, these 3 are likely used capsules or used cavities, whereas this one is still holding a whole host of bees inside of there. So these 3 you could, for example, clean out or replace, but you'd want to leave this one and probably this one too. So that is a biggie, is that if you decide that you like an insect hotel and you commit to putting it in your yard, you have to commit for at least 1 year, because otherwise, well, commit for a year. It's my recommendation. All right. So at the end of the day, the reason that I am so pushy about insect hotels and native planting and not to use pesticides is because pollinators are the essential workers of the planet. And that's because up to 95% of our flowering plants on land requires some kind of animal-aided pollination. And it just so happens that bees are the best pollinators out there. They are the essential workers of the planet. And without them, we would not have our plants. We'd lose roughly 95% of our plants because they wouldn't reproduce. So when we provide for our bees, we're not only providing for them, but we're providing for the entire ecosystem by helping these essential workers have a place to stay, have enough food to eat, and have a safe place to roam without the danger of noxious chemicals coming after them. And of course, by providing for a healthy ecosystem, it's also providing for all the members that live in it, including you and me with longer hair. All right. So thank you all for being my captive audience. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them. There was a lot of information. There will be a quiz tomorrow. 200 questions, 1 bonus question, but it'll be worth 200 points. So.
Kaitlyn, thank you so much. That was great. Why don't we take the yeah, great, so people can see you a little better. That's great. If since I'm the one running the Zoom, I'm going to actually start with a question, if that's okay. Maybe I missed this along the way, but so you said that the the insect hotels, so they're, I mean, they are naturally occurring. Of course, you talked about you can often find them in trees, and you showed us, right? Mm-hmm. So if they naturally occur, why do we need to build them?
So especially in urban places where we've removed a lot of the native tree cover, you typically will also only find these holes in older growing trees, which if we, kind of look around, a lot of the older trees have been removed, either for, whatever purpose we have there. So really the insect hotel, its main purpose is for the places in urban centers to provide for these bees because they don't have as many of these nesting sites in these locations.
Great.
A great
Thank
question,
you.
yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Faye.
I have a problem with wasps. These type of hotels won't attract wasps, will they?
Which wasps are you talking about?
The mean ones. The ones that I always shoo away. I have no idea what kind they are. I see their nests on my walls, on trees. I can see.
Okay, so probably like paper wasps or some sort of yellow jacket. Well, I think yellow jackets nest in the ground. So the answer is no, but never impossible, because nature somehow finds a way in everything. But because of the shape of the insect hotel, and as long as you don't leave any gaps in there, it's very low risk that some sort of social species will come in. So they're very much made to fit for a solitary species, but those social wasps will look at it and they'll immediately think that there's not enough space because they need those big open chambers that they make for their nests.
Okay.
Kaitlyn, there's Kathy asked a question here. She said, is there a problem of different types of bees being together sometimes? Are there some that are enemies?
So yes. So for example, those 2 invasive wool carder bees will also use an insect hotel. So they can fight off other bees that they deem as a threat if your insect hotel is nearby a flower patch, for example. So there is that issue. I don't know really of a way to prevent that. It's just kind of how the game is right now out there. Some people, I mean, if you see a wool carder bee nest, I don't even recommend destroying it because we do have native wool carder bees, and I don't know the distinction just by looking at the nest between them. So it's really just something that they kind of have to work with. Yeah, but good question. There's also some bees that are parasites, but again, you can't prevent them from finding it. I mean, if you want to cut down on those risks, then I would recommend going for a smaller insect hotel, because that way, if it is found by some sort of parasitic bee, you won't lose the entire nest. You basically only lose that small bundle there.
I have a question.
Mhm.
With the, other than placing the insect hotel near, I assume near flowers that bees like, is there anything else that one should do to sort of encourage, I mean, other than like putting out a vacancy sign or something like that, but.
A welcome
I
sign
mean-
is good. Maybe a welcome mat on the ground in front of
Oh,
them.
okay.
No, I mean, it's really just about providing that extra habitat for them. I mean, they
Okay.
will find it. I forgot to mention, but the PolliNation project that we started, we're running a pilot study this year since we can't do the workshops. So we gave roughly 60 of them out already. And I think pretty much every single person who has placed them has found something that has made a
Wow,
nest there.
okay. Yeah, because I tried placing them all. My wife bought one several years ago and we tried placing it. And after watching your wonderful presentation, I realized we stuck it up in like a branch inside a pine tree or something, and it just.
Yeah, they'll never see that.
Yeah, exactly. It's just too remote. We sort of figured that out as we were going along, but.
All right, good. That's part of the process. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's science right there.
Yeah, I love science.
I'd like to jump in.
Mhm.
So in regards to attracting bees, years ago, I think my daughter got it at a plant rescue. The cup plant, the Cephalium perfoliatum from my native plant book. So I planted it next to the house, first mistake, but it grows about 6 feet tall. It was brilliant, and it's called a cup plant because of the leaves make a cup and birds come and drink out of it. And it was a bee magnet, but it was next to the house, and the root was probably 6 feet. So anyways, I had to take it away, and I think I kept the seeds and gave it away. But the cup plant, if you could find it, and that's brilliant. And if we have time and someone wants to know about how to successfully remove buckthorn and keep it away, I will share our success with you.
Excellent. Yeah, cup plants are beautiful. We have them at the EIC if anyone would like to see an example before investing in one. But exactly as you described, they get very tall, but they're beautiful.
Kathy, do you have something else you wanted to say?
But I think I may have forgotten.
Oh.
Sorry, I'll have to.
Okay.
We'll come
Dive
back to
in.
you, but Linda asked a question here. She said, would it make any sense to put an insect hotel near a vegetable garden?
Absolutely, yes. Vegetables, of course, you can tell if a pollinator has visited your vegetable plant because that's why you have vegetables there. So fun
Wow.
fact, you can tell it at a party to impress your friends. There is actually a bee that is specific to squash. So if you have a squash plant and you have a squash that has grown, you were visited by a single species of squash bee.
Great.
Cool.
Go ahead, Kathy.
Okay, when you asked about where you would use these insect hotels, I've had them over the years. My sister bought me the Hilton Hotel of bee hotels, and then she bought me a little teeny one, which I gave to a friend. And that one is living in Boston Edison in neighborhood in Detroit, and everyone is filled. Earlier towards the end of winter, I could see the bees coming in and out. Now they're all stuffed full. But I've never had any luck. Maybe I took them in the garage and probably did that. But that's why in wooded areas, more like in parks, where they used to remove dead trees, now they tend to leave them there because the bees and other animals, I suspect, live in those cavities. So I
Best
know
part
I
of
went to
nature.
your place last weekend, the EIC,
Mhm.
Environmental Interpretive Center, on a walk, and in the back, there, first of all, there's a gazillion birds,
Oh,
different calls, and then there's a lot of bullfrogs and different species of animals and ducks and stuff, but there are a lot of holes in the trees, and they leave the dead trees there.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly that. That's the best part about nature, is that even if something passes away, it is still very much alive in the fact that it provides for other species there. So exactly like you said. And then the dead trees are excellent food sources for woodpeckers and sapsuckers. They sometimes, serve as nesting sites for owls if they are big enough, or different types of mammals. So yeah, exactly what you said. Mhm. But it is interesting that part of the study that we're running right now is to actually try and correlate if there is a relationship to the area people are in and how successful their hotels are. So that will probably tell us something. We don't know what.
Well, Detroit was better than West Bloomfield.
And that's interesting because you think about all the factories over there, but yeah, that's cool. Although I will say that something interesting about Detroit is because of all of the sort of empty plots that had been left to kind of revert back, that's actually pretty good bee habitat. So they had a lot of, I think someone mentioned there being a lot of bumblebees over there now, because bumblebees look for that kind of undisturbed ground to build their nests in. So yeah, you'd never think, but Detroit is very much alive and thriving in the natural world. Just interesting stuff.
Great. Well, first, we want to really thank Kaitlyn for the presentation, introducing us to the PolliNation project and all of that, and
Yeah.
really great. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
before we let people go, I wanted to actually turn things over to Faye Wolf, who's one of the co-chairs of our green team, to share some information about a project that we're working on right now. And we'll just turn things over to Faye.
Hi, everyone. You should have just received at 7:30 an email from the show about a program called Brit Hazone, which is from Hazone. And I really encourage you to look at that email. It's about a roadmap for sustainability. And it's things that we can do personally, section by section, very small changes that they ask for a 6-week commitment that make a big change if everybody does it as a group. So we actually have a community group, a Beth Ahm community group of Brit Hazone. I encourage all of you to try it. The first 10 people who sign up, and actually I only have, I think 5, maybe 4 left, will receive, can you see this? Because I'm not, okay. So this is a sustainability, a backpack from a company called TerraCycle. It is made from used juice boxes, and it is filled with the topic. This particular distribution is reduce household waste. So it's actually filled with really, really cool projects. And I've already, just since that email came, went out, I've had 2 people sign up already. So if you want one of these kits, I urge you to sign up. There are 6 different sections. One was reduce or transition to a plant-based diet. Another one is reduce household waste, reduce food waste, reduce energy waste. And they give you a roadmap to do it that makes it really simple. And I've actually had fun doing this program. I'm learning new things, and I think there's always something new to learn. And it's actually a great community, and it's a national project that we have a community group at Beth Ahm. So I encourage everyone to look at the email me, which is on that particular email if there's any questions, or call me. And I hope you join our group.
Great, Faye. And for those who are not members of the congregation and haven't gotten our emails, you can just contact me. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to give you the information and send you over to Faye. Let me do that right now.
And,
go ahead.
sorry,
Yeah,
to say that Stephen Rubenstein did a great YouTube on this. So if you just want to go to YouTube and search for Congregation Beth Ahm Brit Hazon, it will come up. So he did a great explanation, much better than mine, on what the
yeah,
program
so
is.
it's Brit Hazon for those who, there it is. Great. So thank you to Faye, thank you to the Green
Thank
team,
you.
and thank you again to Kaitlyn for being with us and for sharing all the information. And hope people will join us again for other Green team events and presentations in the future. Thanks so much, everyone.